Throughout the Halo universe, there are battles spoken of in every corner of the galaxy. The fall of Reach, Forerunners versus the Flood, the Human Covenant War, the discovery of the Halo rings, legendary stories of Spartans, Arbiters, regular soldiers, and prophets, light against dark. But there are other stories too, smaller, quieter, stories that shape the galaxy just as profoundly, yet often remain untold. Tonight, we explore one of those forgotten chapters. A moment when the smallest, most ridiculed species in the Covenant rose up to make themselves heard. A rebellion born not from power, but from desperation. A fire that began deep in the underbelly of the Covenant and raged all the way to the heart of High Charity itself. This is the story of the Unggoy Rebellion. The Unggoy, known to humans simply as grunts, were never meant to lead armies. They were never meant to question authority or challenge the ancient hierarchy of the Covenant. They were workers, laborers, disposable soldiers. A race brought into a war they never asked for, to fight for gods they didn't worship, under masters who barely saw them as living beings. For years, they endured mistreatment in silence, their homeworld stripped of resources, their language mocked, their soldiers thrown into battle without strategy, without honor, without hope. But even the smallest flame, when ignored, can grow dangerous. And one day, the Unggoy reached their breaking point. A moment of betrayal, quiet, overlooked, sparked a fury that would shake an empire. In this video, we will follow the story from the very beginning. We'll witness the life of the Unggoy under Covenant rule, crowded in methane factories and beneath the crushing boots of the Sangheili. We'll uncover the tragedy that ignited their rage and walk alongside them as they fought back against a society built to keep them down. We'll see how their uprising changed the Covenant forever, how the smallest rebels forced even the most powerful leaders to rethink their place in the great journey. Whether you're a veteran of the Halo lore or someone curious to learn the deeper stories beneath the games, this tale is a rare window into the lives of those the galaxy forgot. A reminder that even the quietest voices can echo across the stars. So settle in, let the galaxy grow still around you, and join me for a story of rage, rebellion, and remembrance. Chapter 1. Life under the Covenant. Long before the rebellion, long before the flames touched High Charity, the Unggoy lived in a world defined by hierarchy and silence. They were not born into the Covenant. They were brought into it, quietly, forcibly, and without ceremony. Even in the darkest corners of High Charity, the Unggoy found ways to keep their spirit alive. As the endless shifts wore on and the shadows lengthened, you could sometimes hear their voices echoing off the steel walls, soft, rhythmic chants in the language of their people. Not songs of worship to the Forerunners or hymns to the great journey, but songs of home. Balaho itself was a harsh world, but one woven with meaning for the Unggoy. It was a world that would have seemed inhospitable to outsiders, but to the Unggoy, it was home. A place where they thrived, where their distinct biology gave them an edge. They evolved in the dim blueness of its frozen wetlands, under stars shining through a layer of heavy methane clouds. Their bodies were stout, arms short but capable, built to dig through packed ice and navigate flooded tunnels. Their large, luminous eyes adapted for the low light. Every Unggoy was born breathing methane, their bodies structured around a cycle of gas and pressure that made them uniquely vulnerable when forced to live elsewhere. But beneath their physiology, beneath the armor-like plates that grew along their backs and shoulders, the Unggoy had something else, a culture built on closeness. Families were not divided by wealth, by tribe, or even by blood. An Unggoy clutch, what humans might call a family unit, was an extended collective of dozens, sometimes hundreds. Raised together, fed together, survived and shared joy together. Children were not raised by pairs, but by entire communities. Love, in Unggoy culture, was not a private thing. It was a communal gift. Mates bonded for life, often marked by the exchange of shared methane reserves before covenant regulation began. It was a gesture as ancient and intimate as any ritual of the Sangheili, but none of that mattered to the prophets. To the covenant, Unggoy were resources. To the other species, especially the Sangheili and Kig-Yar, they were nuisances. It was common for Unggoy to be yelled at when moving too slowly, struck if they spoke out of turn, or used for menial tasks no one else would endure. If an Unggoy stepped out of line, a Sangheili commander could silence them with the flick of a wrist. Food was rationed not by need, but by usefulness. Disobedience meant withheld resources. A methane refill delayed was a death sentence. There was no court for the Unggoy to plead their case, no representative to lobby for better conditions, no tablets or sermons to comfort them in the name of the great journey. The covenant reminded them every day, "You are here because we allow it. You are here because we own you." And yet, somehow, the Unggoy held on to hope. Some found solace in humor, a defense mechanism as old as suffering itself. Among the ranks, they invented jokes about the Sangheili's obsession with honor, about the Kig-Yar's greed, even about the Sanshayum's fragile bodies. Humor was survival, a rebellion of the voice, when the hands were still chained. Others found hope in faith, though not in the forerunners or the rings. Some Unggoy genuinely believed that if they worked hard enough, prayed quietly enough, or survived long enough, someone in the covenant would recognize their worth. A naive hope, but a hope nonetheless. But there was a third kind of Unggoy, one forged by experience, scarred by reality. The ones who fought in frontline combat, who watched their friends run into plasma fire because a Sangheili commander wanted more bodies out there. The ones who survived battles only to be mocked for not dying like the others had. Among these Unggoy, hope took a different shape. Not humor, not prayer, but bitterness. These were the Unggoy who began to whisper, who kept track of every broken promise, every shortage, every death that came too easily under the weight of oppression. The covenant never noticed the whispers, or if they did, they didn't care. Because what could the Unggoy possibly do? A race of small, shivering creatures, scared of the dark and left gasping without their methane tanks. What could they ever be? But servants. That was the arrogance of the covenant. That was the mistake that cost them so much. Because while the prophets preached submission and the Sangheili enforced hierarchy, the Unggoy were changing, quietly, patiently, waiting for something, anything, to tip the balance. They didn't know when it would come, or how. But beneath the layers of labor, mourning, and survival, something was brewing. It was not just the desire for food or for comfort, but for dignity, the desire not to be forgotten. And that desire was about to become unstoppable. All it needed was a spark. Chapter 2. The Catalyst. The breaking point came not with fire, but with silence. For the Unggoy, who had lived in the shadow of the covenant's grandeur for generations, survival was not simply a matter of labor or loyalty. It was a matter of legacy. Even when denied comfort, denied respect, denied basic rights, the Unggoy retained something the covenant could not take: the ability to create life, to build community, to raise new generations. In the darkness of the methane-filled living chambers of high charity, parents would huddle close, sharing warmth with clutchmates, telling stories of Balaho, of the blue ice that glittered under a dull sun, and of their ancestors who lived free in the lowlands. They dreamed of one day returning home, of raising children who would see the skies not through the haze of methane tanks, but with their own eyes, under the raw air of Balaho's bitter wind. But that dream began to die. It happened slowly at first, not with sickness, not with war, but with absence. Unggoy males, strong, healthy, fertile for generations, began to discover that something was wrong. Clutches once expected to grow into hundreds of new lives instead remained still and untouched because the males who should have fathered them could no longer do so. Entire family lines went quiet. Entire communities felt the silence spreading through their future. At first, the Unggoy believed it was environmental strain, recycled air, poor living conditions, the stress of overcrowded districts. But the whispers grew, the questions sharpened, and eventually, the truth surfaced. It was not disease, it was sabotage. Their narcotic, the recreational inhalant known as infusion, used only by Unggoy and by no other Covenant species, had been tainted. Not by accident, not by negligence, but deliberately. And the ones responsible were not Sangheili, not prophets, not even the Covenant military. It was the Kig-Yar. The Unggoy and the Kig-Yar had long shared habitation spaces in the lower decks of High Charity. But while the Unggoy bred rapidly, the Kig-Yar reproduced slowly, carefully, protectively, guarding their eggs as fiercely as the Sangheili guarded their honor. As Unggoy numbers swelled, living space shrank. Vents clogged, habitats cramped. Entire clutches of Kig-Yar eggs were crushed or smothered in shared nesting chambers. And in retaliation, the Kig-Yar poisoned infusion, lacing it with a sterilizing agent that would affect only one species, the Unggoy. When the truth was brought to the prophets, the Unggoy expected justice, a trial, a punishment, something. Instead, the Sanshayum dismissed the crime. The Kig-Yar involved were not imprisoned, not executed, not even publicly shamed. They were fined, as if the lives of millions of future Unggoy were nothing more than damaged property. An accounting error, a resource shortage to be corrected later. That was the moment the Unggoy finally understood. The Covenant did not protect them. The prophets did not care for them. To the Sanshayum, the loss of Unggoy fertility was not a tragedy. It was an inconvenience. Unggoy could be replaced. New workers could be bred. A species that lives to serve does not need a future. And when the Unggoy begged for answers, their cries fell into the dust. That was when the air began to change. In the forgotten layers of Covenant society, beneath the glittering spires and the stained glass temples, grief turned to anger. Anger turned to clarity, and clarity turned to rage. They say a species that has nothing left to lose. With whatever scraps they could gather, they built weapons. Pressurized methane tanks became explosives. Industrial drills became blades. Disassembled needlers became hidden guns. And every tool they once used to serve the Covenant became a weapon to turn against it. In the shadows, in the cracks between platforms and vents, the Unggoy's quiet despair finally hardened into purpose. They would no longer plead. They would no longer wait. They would no longer serve. The Unggoy, the smallest species in the Covenant, began to prepare for war. Chapter 3. Ignition. There is a moment before every storm, a kind of stillness that settles over the world. A moment so quiet it can almost be mistaken for peace. That was the moment before the Unggoy Rebellion began. It didn't come with a declaration or a cry for battle, not with banners or fleets or speeches from a throne. It began in the maintenance tunnels beneath the Covenant's holy city, High Charity, when the first Unggoy rose up. In the early hours of a routine cycle, a Sangheili guard was found dead in a methane circulation hub, his armor torn open by tools he once thought beneath his attention. His body wasn't discovered until hours later, after the Unggoy had already sealed the chamber and sabotaged the pressure lines. That was the first strike, but it was not the last. Before the Sangheili could regroup, another explosion hit one of the primary food distribution centers. A blast so violent it ruptured 2 full methane silos and sent flaming gas screeching through the corridors of the lower districts. Entire wings of the station went dark. Alarms blared, airlocks sealed, and in the chaos, the Unggoy surged forward. This was no random violence. It was coordinated. Across the lower sectors of High Charity, decades of quiet rebellion erupted into a fury the Covenant had never seen before. Unggoy engineers, long dismissed as simple laborers, used their knowledge of gas valves and fuel lines to rig the infrastructure against their oppressors. They knew where the weak points were, knew which pressure points controlled access to ventilation and gravity, knew which bridges could be collapsed with enough charge at the right supports. They didn't need advanced weapons. They had preparation, they had numbers, they had rage. Unggoy workers took control of machinery bays and turned them into makeshift armories. Unggoy soldiers, hardened by years on the front lines, broke into storage vaults and seized plasma pistols and discarded needlers. Even small packs of civilian Unggoy fought together, ambushing Covenant patrols with welding torches, sharpened excavation tools, and bursting methane tanks used like grenades. Every sector they gained gave them access to more gear. Every tool they repurposed turned into something deadly. The Sangheili, known for their discipline and battlefield prowess, were unprepared for the chaos. They trained to wage war against organized armies, but they had never trained for a rebellion coming from below. A rebellion led by workers, by servants, by the ones they never thought would fight back. When the alarms spread through High Charity's command spires, the first reports were ignored, then dismissed, then mocked. Unggoy uprising was not a phrase spoken with fear, it was spoken with amusement. But then, the casualty reports began. Sangheili squad, missing. Entire methane wing, overrun. Explosive breach detected, Deck 6. Attempts to retake Corridor 44-7 failed. Hundreds of Covenant personnel, dead, thousands more, cut off. Now the Sangheili were no longer laughing. By the time they realized the Unggoy had seized control of multiple sectors, it was already too late to contain the rebellion through intimidation. The Unggoy no longer feared their masters. They fought with a desperation few in the Covenant had ever seen. Squads of Unggoy flung themselves at Sangheili battle teams, not just with weapons, but with live fuel tanks strapped to their backs, ready to detonate themselves if it meant taking their killers with them. Unggoy field techs shut down artificial gravity in the lower decks, turning entire battlefields into weightless arenas. Sangheili warriors, trained in grounded combat with heavy armor, found themselves helplessly drifting while Unggoy darted among them with spiked tools and scavenged pistols. Even Kig-Yar sharpshooters, long considered agile and deadly, found themselves outmaneuvered by swarms of Unggoy, attacking from air ducts and maintenance shafts, places the tall Covenant species could never reach. In a single day, High Charity became a war zone. The Unggoy, who once cleaned its walls and polished its floors, now filled its sacred corridors with fire and screams. What had once been a holy city became a battlefield without a front line. Every level, every airlock, every loader bay contested by a species that had nothing left to lose. There is a saying in war: fear the one who fights for conquest. Respect the one who fights for honor, but tremble before the one who fights because they have been denied everything else, including the right to live. The Unggoy had become that kind of enemy, and for the Covenant, the nightmare was only beginning. Chapter 4. High Charity under siege. High Charity, the jewel of the Covenant, a station built of ancient stone and star-forged steel, a monument to the Forerunners, a beacon of faith, and for a brief, terrible moment in its long history, it became a battlefield. When the Unggoy Rebellion erupted into full flame, the Sangheili and their superiors were slow to react. They believed it would burn itself out, that the grunts would panic, fight amongst themselves, or collapse under the first organized response. They were wrong, because by the time the Covenant Command issued its first formal order, the Unggoy had already taken multiple districts, and then they took more. The rebellion spread not like flame, but like floodwater. Not in a single direction, but outward, everywhere, at once. And suddenly, Even the highest-ranking Sangheili and Sanshayum could no longer ignore the truth. High Charity was under siege. The Covenant responded with force, with overwhelming force. Sangheili combat patrols were deployed. Kig-Yar sharpshooters were stationed at intersections to cut off Unggoy movement. Yanmei drones were sent to patrol ventilation shafts and destroy barricades. But every victory cost them more than they expected. The Unggoy were not fighting with numbers alone. They were fighting with knowledge. They knew the station's blind spots because they had cleaned them. They knew where to break the pipes because they had installed them. They knew how to reroute power, how to disable locks, how to sabotage doors, because for years they had done it all in silence. And now they used that silence as a weapon. Entire patrols of Covenant troops vanished into the depths of High Charity's industrial gut, ambushed by swarms of Unggoy operating in near blackness, endless tunnels thick with methane fog and boiling steam. Pressure valves were ripped open, releasing volatile gas into the air, turning whole corridors into death traps for any species that breathed oxygen. The Covenant treated the Unggoy like tools, and now they were dying to the hands those tools once held. One of the most infamous moments of the rebellion came not from fire or blade, but from sound. As a Sangheili command squad attempted to retake a landing platform near the naval docks, the Unggoy began to chant, not in fear, not in mockery, but in unison. A battle chant, a war cry, a sound that echoed off the steel and the stone and the holy spires. It said one thing: we are still here. That was the moment fear began to change sides. The Covenant had never faced an enemy like this, never fought a force willing to die by the hundreds, so long as one more Sangheili fell with them. Never imagined that those they laughed at, those they treated like fodder and refuse, would willingly strap live explosives to their tanks and hurl themselves into fire just to take one tyrant with them. No battle plan, no retreat, no surrender. The Unggoy had turned High Charity into a nightmare, but the Covenant was not just built on arrogance, it was built on power. And soon, the power struck back. Elite honor guards, armed with energy swords and clad in heavy ceremonial armor, were ordered into the lower districts. They were told not to reclaim the city, but to purge it, to end the rebellion not with capture or negotiation, but with extermination. That was the first time the Unggoy truly understood the cost of their war, because even an oppressed species can bleed, and even the smallest flame can be drowned by the weight of a sword. Deep beneath the radiant spires and gold-lined temples, the battle that had once felt like justice now felt like survival. Like every moment was a precious trade. One Unggoy life for one more breath of freedom. One Sangheili corpse for one more chance to scream their story toward the sky. The rebellion had reached its peak, but so too had the danger. And as the Covenant unleashed its full might on the Unggoy, the rebellion that began in silence threatened to end in fire. Chapter 5. The Turning Point. In the early days of the Unggoy Rebellion, the air was thick with fire and fury. For the first time in Covenant history, a species that wielded no political power, no cultural standing, and no ancient lineage had brought the Empire to its knees. In the lower decks of High Charity, the Unggoy had risen not as servants, but as soldiers, not as the forgotten shadows of the Covenant, but as the ones who had finally found a voice in war. And for a brief moment, it worked. Entire sections of the Holy City fell under Unggoy control. Sangheili patrols retreated through burning corridors. Kig-Yar snipers were silenced in their roosts. Even the Yanmei, fast, airborne, loyal to orders and coin, were forced to abandon strongholds when Unggoy detonated compressed methane tanks in the vents. The Covenant was not prepared. They had never dreamed the Unggoy could be anything more than a disposable tide, a noise to be tolerated, a mass to be used. And now? Now they saw what they had created. Not a labor caste, a powder keg. The Unggoy had proven something more dangerous than skill, more powerful than plasma. They had shown that a species with nothing left to lose could dismantle an empire from its own foundation. And so, the Covenant did what it always did in the face of fear. It struck back, not with correction, not with compromise, but with crushing, absolute force. The ruling prophets, stunned that their holy city had fallen to the lowest of Covenant species, invoked decree after decree of martial law. The Sangheili responded with ruthless precision. The Kig-Yar responded with spiteful cruelty. Patrols tightened, kill lanes were set, vent shafts were flooded with fire and gas, and leading the charge was the Arbiter. By this point in Covenant history, the title of Arbiter had already been twisted into a mark of shame, a role given to the disgraced and the condemned, sent to accomplish the impossible or die. The Arbiter appointed to end the Unggoy Rebellion was Kig-Yar, a fallen Sangheili whose mission was not restoration, but silencing. To him, the Unggoy were not rebels. They were a stain to be erased. With orders to extinguish the uprising by any means necessary, Kig-Yar drove wave after wave of Sangheili assault squads into Unggoy-held sectors. Cloaked warriors slipped through the lower passages with energy swords alive in their hands, leaving trails of lavender blood in dim, methane-lit corridors. Entire Unggoy strongholds, built from cargo crates and welding rigs, were cut down in minutes, trapped, cornered, purged. But for every corridor retaken, for every clutch silenced, more kept fighting, more kept coming, more kept dying on their own terms. And that terrified the Covenant more than anything else. The Unggoy weren't breaking. They were hardening, and they were beginning to win small victories. Unacceptable victories. It was then, at this exact moment, just as the Covenant began to feel the first wound of fear, that they committed the single most brutal act of the entire rebellion. They turned their guns not on High Charity, but on Balaho, the Unggoy homeworld. Without warning, without diplomacy, without mercy, Covenant warships entered orbit and did what they had been built to do. Plasma lances, superheated beams capable of turning continents to glass, struck the surface of the planet. Blue ice boiled black. Vast lakes of liquid methane evaporated into storms of toxic cloud. Entire generations, untouched by the rebellion, unaware of the battles, still living in forgotten cold villages and underground hatcheries, were erased in a matter of minutes. The Covenant didn't glass the entire planet. Just enough. Enough to leave a message that would live for centuries. Enough to show every Unggoy on every ship, every station, every level of High Charity exactly what happened to those who challenged the hierarchy. Enough to break a species without erasing it. Unggoy living on the station received the holofeeds. Some watched in silence. Some screamed. Some fell to their knees and tore their armor apart. Others, hardened by days of bloodshed, simply tightened their harnesses and prepared to die in battle. It was in that moment, when the strikes hit their world while they were still fighting in the tunnels, that the Unggoy realized something terrible. This was not a war they could win. They could kill patrols, they could sabotage pipes, they could resist for days. But they could not stop fleets, they could not stop plasma. They could not stop a god empire willing to burn their homeworld to destroy their spirit. And so, for the first and only time during the rebellion, the Unggoy leaders gathered, not to plan another assault, but to ask a different question. How many more of us will die before none of us are left? Their answer was the hardest truth a people can speak aloud. Enough. They surrendered. Not because they were defeated, but because survival of even a fraction of their people was all they had left to fight for. Unggoy everywhere dropped their tools, their weapons, their makeshift armor. They removed the canisters they had rigged as bombs and left them on the floor. From the lowest tunnels of High Charity to the deepest trenches of Balaho, the Unggoy stopped fighting, and the Covenant, seeing they had broken the resistance, allowed them to live. After all, workers were still needed. Grunts were still valuable. Methane still had to be pumped. A dead Unggoy rebel was less useful than a broken one. The rebellion had been crushed, but something far greater had been born. The Covenant had learned fear. The Unggoy had found identity. The galaxy, which once saw them as comic relief, as cannon fodder, as throwaways, would one day learn what the Covenant now understood. The Unggoy were not weak. They had simply been denied the chance to rise. Chapter 6. The Aftermath. When the fires of rebellion faded and the corridors of high charity grew cold again, a new truth settled into place. The Unggoy had surrendered, but not as the Covenant expected. They hadn't been crushed by fear. They hadn't broken from cowardice. They had surrendered for one reason alone: to survive. And survival carries power. Even the Arbiter who led the suppression, Kig-Yar, understood this by the end. He had stopped the uprising only by ordering the partial glassing of Balaho, forcing the Unggoy into surrender not through strategy alone, but through a threat great enough to shatter the last of their hope. Yet in the embers of that final act, he did not walk away with scorn. He walked away with respect. For the first time in Covenant memory, the Unggoy had stood together, not as soldiers trained for obedience, but as a people willing to die for their future. And among the Sangheili, a culture built on honor and resolve, this was not forgotten. Instead of purging the survivors, the Sangheili did something unexpected. They forgave them, not out of kindness, but out of recognition. The Unggoy had shown strength. They had shown unity. And in the wake of the rebellion, their role in the Covenant military changed forever. No longer would they be weapons of last resort, sent charging into fire unarmed and unprotected. No longer would they be forbidden from wielding military-grade firearms. In the years following the rebellion, the Unggoy were granted access to real weaponry: plasma pistols, needlers, even the occasional fuel rod cannon. Not as an accident, not as charity, but as acknowledgement. They trained with Sangheili, fought beside them, laughed with them. In time, they formed integrated squads. Units that had once been exclusively Sangheili now marched with Unggoy infantry at their side. It was not equality, but it was a beginning. And among the Unggoy themselves, something deeper changed. For the first time, they had been seen, not as tools, not as fodder, but as fighters. They carried the scars of the rebellion, yes. The cratered ice of Balaho never fully healed. The stories whispered among the clutches still spoke of lost younglings, burned burrows, and families erased from orbit. But those stories were no longer just tragedies. They were oaths. The Unggoy had fought for a place in a galaxy that never wanted to give them one. And though they were forced back into service, though they still labored under the shadow of the Covenant, they never returned to silence, because something else had been born. Identity. A sense of self, not assigned, but earned in fire and blood. A reminder to every Unggoy born after the rebellion that even the smallest species can rise, and even the quietest voice can echo across the stars. When Unggoy march now, they do so with weapons in hand, with training in their hearts, and with the memory that once, when all hope seemed lost, they fought the gods of their universe and survived. And so, the Unggoy Rebellion came to an end. Not as a story of victory, but as a story of awakening, a moment when the smallest warriors in the Covenant stood tall enough to be seen. Their legacy would ripple through generations, shaping the Covenant, shaping the war, and reshaping the way even their enemies understood courage. If you enjoyed this story, let me know down in the comments which Halo lore you'd like to explore next. And if you're new here, consider subscribing so you don't miss more long-form lore just like this. And please leave a like if you enjoyed this video. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay rotten, Spartan.